you trust something because you trust the person. So it's in the absence of legitimacy of a source, you substitute that legitimacy of a source of content with the trust in the person who has sent it to you.
Hi, I'm Nidhi.
Hi, I'm Shashank.
Welcome to the CCG Tech Podcast. Hi, today we're in conversation with Tarunima from Tattle about the misinformation ecosystem in India. Hi, Tarunima. It's so good to have you here. We've been following your work for a while. So, can you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself and about your work?
Thanks, Nidhi and Shashank, for having me here. My name is Tarunima, as you mentioned. So I'm the research lead at Tattle, which is a civic tech organization that builds tools and datasets to respond to inaccurate and harmful content. So the buzzwords that we are more familiar with are fake news and hate speech, but I think those words can be more confusing than explanatory, which is why I prefer to say inaccurate and harmful content. My own background is as a technologist, as an engineer, as well as in public policy. And depending on the day, I choose which role I play.
That's great, Tarunima. Thanks for being here. We hear this phrase fake news and we hear misinformation, we hear disinformation. Do we need to talk about the differences in these phrases and, what is correct to use or not? I know there is some discussion around this topic, but would love to get your thoughts on this.
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, fake news is definitely the one that's more commonly heard and understood. Misinformation, disinformation is, I would say, a more specialized term that maybe people who are tracking either the academic space or the policy space would be familiar with. I make the distinction. I think the distinction between misinformation and disinformation is important, and Tattle very clearly says that we work on misinformation and not disinformation, where disinformation sort of gives primacy to the intent behind creating that content, right? So disinformation means that someone is willfully, or that content has been willfully created to deceive. Whereas misinformation is content that deceives. It may or may not have been created with that intention. And so in the post 2016, US election Brexit vote, the term disinformation was more commonly used. I think from our perspective, when we're looking at what's happening in India, who is creating or tracking who is creating inaccurate content or content that tries to harm someone, from our perspective, is not going to solve the problem. It's in many cases, we know where some of this content is coming from, but that doesn't mean that that point of origin or like knowing that source helps us address the challenge or the malaise of misinformation or fake news. So we use the word misinformation, but disinformation is also something a lot of people care about.
So you mean to say that when certain information is shared that is intended to cause harm, then we can bracket it as disinformation. And other avenues where, because of lack of knowledge or awareness, some information gets shared that inadvertently causes harm, that's misinformation. Is my understanding correct?
I think actually you did describe it well. I think I'm making a distinction in terms of what is the experience for the viewer of the content versus what is the intention of the creator of the content, right? Whereas, so for me, misinformation is focusing on the experience of the people receiving the content, and disinformation is focusing on the people who are creating the content. I guess that's the distinction I am drawing.
Before we move on, I wanted to ask whether fake news is an okay phrase to use when we talk about misinformation. I know that I've been told that it comes from a certain thinking and a certain pocket of people, but it is a popular term. Let's say my parents will associate more with fake news than when I say misinformation.
Fake news is a colloquial term, and I am not opposed to it as long as it's an entry point for people to have a discussion to learn more about it. I think it becomes a problematic term when we sort of throw it around as a way to discount a certain perspective. I think it's sometimes used very lazily to capture a whole range of tactics in debates and tactics in propaganda. But to the extent that I think the average citizen uses the word fake news, and then it becomes a way to learn more about it. And so I do think there are better words for it. I think there is always this tension between being accessible with your knowledge and being sort of detailed and accurate. And so I think to the extent that the term fake news gets people to learn more about it, I'm okay with it.
Awesome. We'll use misinformation for this conversation.
Yes, I think that is a better word.
Thank you so much, Tarunima, for explaining that. Now that we have the terms and the phrases clear, we'll jump right into the problem. So, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad would you say the misinformation problem is?
I would say a 6 or a 7. But I think it's interesting because, like, if I think of, say, the US, the vaccine hesitancy problem is mind-boggling that, an advanced or a rich economy would still be dealing with these issues, right? And so I think about our trust in experts, despite the, prevalence of alternative healing techniques in India, but I don't think we have that challenge of people falling for or being suspicious and skeptical of vaccines, right? So I think in some ways the challenge is better, but then I think in other domains, especially in terms of like how much the government interferes and in terms of the independence of media, etc., I think we're worse. So I would say 6 or 7, and I think that's me being an optimist.
So I think always good to be an optimist in these things. But you said that it's about a 6 or a 7 as compared to the rest of the world. Any
I would say
ideas
a
to why
7.
that
So I'm
is?
saying I would say a 7, right? I would say a 10 is probably like a completely totalitarian state with all information and everything, just, which is the cliche of 1984. So I'm saying if that is your worst case, I would say India is at a 7 or a 6. Yes. This is a hot take. I should be more careful about this number. I hadn't thought of it. Good question. But sorry, Nidhi, what was your follow-up question?
Why do you think that is?
Why do I think that is? I think just for the reasons I alluded to earlier, right? Which is that I mean we see real world consequences that go as extreme as death, right? It's not indirect in the way that, I read something and then it informed my actions 1 year down the line. It is that I read something and I acted in a mob and that led to loss of life, right? So for me, that is as extreme as it gets. And I don't think that, misinformation or just that piece of content explains everything. I think when there is an act of violence, there are a lot of different factors at play, but it definitely is fuel to the fire. So I think for those reasons, I would say it is at least, like I would say it's a 7. If the question is why isn't it higher, I think it's because I also think that we are not at a place where we are completely suspicious of science or expertise. For whatever reasons, there is some respect for the scientific enterprise still, and so we don't believe or we are willing to accept that climate change is anthropogenic. We are willing to accept medical advice. And I think in some of those ways, we're better than some of the other contexts. So that's why I didn't put it at an 8 or a 9.
That's very useful. And Tarunima, what would you say is India's vaccine problem? So let's say that you were talking about the vaccine misinformation being so big in the US. So what would you say that what does India face when it comes to misinformation that we can call the India's vaccine problem?
So is the question specifically around, say, health-related misinformation, or are you just saying that what is like the biggest crisis for us to solve in misinformation?
Yeah, what's the biggest crisis? So let's
What's
say
the
when
biggest,
when you talked about the US, you said, the vaccine misinformation just seems out of proportion. So what would you parallelly say we face in India?
Yeah, I think since now we've been looking at the space for 4+ years, right? I think it's useful to separate out these different sort of types of misinformation. So you have misinformation in health, you have misinformation in finance, you have misinformation around political candidates, and you have misinformation around wow science, where in part that could be like, oh, look at this amazing thing that happened in like Antarctica, which isn't true, right? And I think all of these are different. So there are common mechanics to these different types of misinformation, but I also think it's useful to study them separately, because why people fall for each of these is different. And so, for example, when it comes to political issues, motivated reasoning, which is, this idea that I have ideological biases, which is why I reason in a particular way, it becomes a bigger factor. Whereas in some of the other types of misinformation, you might just be sort of lazy reasoning, right? Like this is a sort of constant debate that you will see, like, are people falling for misinformation because they're motivated in their thinking or they're lazy in their thinking? And and so when you say it's like, what's the biggest problem, I think it's hard for me to say it's one thing, because I think people falling for health misinformation is dangerous in its own ways. Like, there are long-term institutional harms, but then people actually falling for WhatsApp rumors and lynching is probably something that you need to respond to like right away, right? So and I think one thing I will always say is that, I'm not one of those people who believes that like everything is because of social media platforms, and that is the only sort of reason why we are seeing the changes that we have seen over the last 2 decades across the world. So yeah, but having said that, I still work on online misinformation and sort of inaccurate and harmful content, because I do think it's an important piece of the puzzle. So that's my dissatisfactory answer, Shashank. I'm not giving you a hot take on this one.
No, that's still very useful, because it makes me feel that for someone who's been working on this for some time, um, questions in India seem to be not just singular, right? There is health related misinformation, there is political related misinformation. We've also seen instances of gender based violence and harm, right? Where there is sort of gender related misinformation. So I absolutely understand where you're coming
Absolutely.
from.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
now actually I'd like to drive you to, we were talking about social media, and I really appreciate your saying that it's not just a social media problem. And that brings me to my next question or other point in discussion, that how does this play out in WhatsApp, right? It's not a very public platform, as we know. Of course, there are groups that India uses popularly, but it's not as public as, let's say, Facebook.
Yeah, so I think the interesting thing with WhatsApp is that even though WhatsApp markets it as a channel for private communication, it is used for content discovery. So technically, private communication should mean that I'm only sharing content on WhatsApp. But since a lot of people in India actually come onto the internet through WhatsApp before they access a social media platform like, say, Facebook, this is the channel that they use to get new information, right? So WhatsApp is a place for content discovery, and the way it works as a place for content discovery is that people will share links to their groups. So if you have a group and I can share a link to the group, right, for and share that link so that someone else can join that group. And often people will create these interest-based groups, all the gamut of things that people are interested in. There are WhatsApp groups that are created for it, and people will share this link. Often they'll share it on Twitter, often they'll share it, ask their friends to pass it around on WhatsApp. And there are also websites that will just aggregate these groups, and so you can just click on these these links and join an interest-based group. So I think one source of misinformation on WhatsApp is actually these sort of content creation groups that then people join, where you don't know other people on those groups. There's no sort of trusted. It's actually very much not private communication at that point, right? And that I think those dynamics are similar to, I guess, your social media dynamics, barring the fact that there is algorithmic amplification. I'm saying it's similar in the sense that there is, say, a page or a forum where you don't know what the provenance or what the source of this content is, but you have joined it because it interests you, or you want to learn something new. And then there might be you're at the mercy of the content creators and the admins of this group, and you just basically are consuming content that might not be accurate. So that's one thing. The other side of WhatsApp is that people, and this has been sort of borne out in ethnographic work as well, is that people trust things on WhatsApp because it comes from someone that they know in the offline world, right? So often your WhatsApp communities will also mimic your offline associations. So be it your family groups or your friends, it's you trust something because you trust the person. So it's in the absence of legitimacy of a source, you substitute that legitimacy of a source of content with the trust in the person who has sent it to you. And so that, I think, is again very different from how social media often works, where it's the algorithmic sort of amplification that pushes something onto your feed, and you don't necessarily know some influencer but that person's stuff seems exciting enough and 10,000 other people have liked it, and so therefore you like it as well.
Tarunima, in your view, we know that WhatsApp has been adding so many features over the past few years, limited number of people in a particular group, permission before being added to a particular group, and, the forwarded tags that now we see for messages that are very popular. Will you say that all of these are not working, or there are sort of workarounds around these sort of safeguards that WhatsApp has been building on its platform?
Yeah, I think what I'd also add to it is that I don't think WhatsApp is sort of unilaterally just building features for more privacy, right? For example, the community feature, where I think which was rolled out 5 months back. I might be getting the month wrong, but yeah, like the community feature is sort of explicitly saying that it's not public at the scale of it's national, so it's not broadcast, but still a community space is not one-to-one private communication, right? So I would say that WhatsApp has to walk this very fine line between saying that we are secure, therefore trust us for financial transactions, but also that it's where people meet and coordinate on plans and coordinate on all good things, and so it allows for certain group dynamics, right? Like I think WhatsApp has to walk that very fine line. Okay, so sorry, I added that as a caveat. Shashank, could you please repeat the question?
WhatsApp has been adding these features, right? So there is a feature that you can add in privacy that no one can automatically add you to a group, for example. There's another feature that, okay, let's say, I don't know what the number is, but 250, 260 or 280 people are the maximum that can be in a group. And we have, because of the misinformation problem, WhatsApp now adds a double tick or a double sort of forward mark on messages that are very popular. So, and WhatsApp says that they have added these features so that people know and they can take informed decisions. But in your experience, do these really work?
I think one thing that is challenging with WhatsApp is that we don't know what has worked and what has not worked, right? And it's usually whatever little we know is because some researcher has like scraped or collected data from a handful of groups, and we don't even know whether those groups are representative of the universe of data that WhatsApp represents. So we actually have sort of very, very approximate, like information on whether, for example, the forward limits worked or not, right? So this was a paper that Kiran Ganimella and his co-authors had done, and where they said that when you place this restriction that you can only forward it to 5 people, the content still goes viral, but I think it just takes like 10 seconds more or something of that sort. So but it's really hard to know whether to what extent all of these things work. I mean, there's a lot of sort of qualitative insight to this. So for example, some people have said that the forwarded tag actually is, instead of being a warning that don't believe this, becomes a stamp of legitimacy that, oh, like this is something that everyone has also shared, right? So it's hard to know what of WhatsApp's sort of techniques and tactics have worked. Having said that, my sort of intuitive sense is that things have gotten, or WhatsApp is not as naive as it was in say 2014, 2016, 2017, right? At the time it was also a smaller team, and so there was this story where there was a person who was managing 1,000 WhatsApp groups for during polling, right? So this person was just managing and pushing party-related content to these 1,000 groups at a very local level. And I trust when WhatsApp says that we have been able to address those kind of use cases, because this is fairly easy to track from metadata, right? Like you have one person who's a part of 1,000 groups, and all this person does is forward content. I think this is one of the easier things to do in spam detection and prevention. But I mean, I do think that the interesting thing with India and many countries in the global south is that labor is often as cheap or cheaper than automation. And so we can find, for the very motivated, you can find workarounds to most of these tech fixes by just throwing more people at a problem or throwing more SIM cards at a problem. Yeah, so I would say data is lacking. it's hard to know what has and has not worked. My lived experience is that I think people have gotten smarter, and news media coverage on this has increased. And I think generally people don't like to be called out for falling for fake news. And this I say from research, right? So if you tell someone that, or if you correct someone on a group and say that, oh, like this is not accurate, usually people are shamed into being quieter in the future. So I think maybe just the media reporting around it and us being used to this platform has now led us to being slightly smarter than we were 4 or 5 years ago.
I think I can talk to you about the WhatsApp problem the whole day, but just a very quick question. Do you think that it's just a WhatsApp problem or a platform problem, let's say, and then there's the deeper question is there's also a people and awareness problem? I know it's not a very sort of articulate question, but what I'm trying to draw your attention to is it specifically a platform problem? And because of the design of the platform, there is this virality issue, or it's a people problem?
I mean, it's usually both. I think what I would say is WhatsApp is not alone in being a mobile instant messaging service, right? So you have Telegram, Signal, and Telegram is far more interesting in some ways than WhatsApp, because you have international sort of, I'm forgetting, I think it was Cambodia, where one of the president was removed from a social media platform, and this president was like, well, I was going to go away anyway, and then just shared their Telegram link and was like, follow me there, right? So in some ways I feel like Telegram, because its governance is so murky, it doesn't use the open whisper like the Signal protocol, so it's not, the encryption protocol is not even open source, so we just have to trust the makers of this platform and the people behind it when they say that it is end-to-end encrypted and it's fully secure. I think so, but I would say basically these mobile instant messaging apps are their own world, and then the social media platforms, I mean, yeah, like I would treat these as two separate buckets, which have some linkages between them. Yeah, and I think what I have consistently said is that these are social technical problems, and to try and separate them as either social or either technical actually becomes very limiting. Like, you have to think of these as systems and think of solutions as like social technical solutions. I think that's the only way you get to something that has a chance of working without hurting a lot of people.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Tarunima. Actually, more on that note, I think we had a really fruitful discussion on problems. But can we talk a little bit more about the solutions? So I know that at Tattle, you have looked into designing content moderation tools, something that can reduce inaccurate or harmful information. So can you tell us a little bit about that? Like what the solutions for these problems could be?
So I think with WhatsApp, when we started, we said, can we start collecting the kind of content that is shared on WhatsApp? And I think this is a desire that many research groups have expressed and tried to work on, right? So we actually get to know how much of WhatsApp is coming, or how much of it overlaps with the more open platforms like Facebook or Twitter. And then the other bit was, for us, we were trying to understand how we were trying to work towards making fact-check content more accessible to Indian social media users, many of whom use WhatsApp mostly through audio notes, videos. They're not necessarily very dexterous at typing. And so a lot of our work is actually about working with Indian social media content and then building tools to make it easy to research, but also easy to access. And so the flagship, or the first project that we had worked on, was actually just something where if you had a piece of message that came on WhatsApp, you could search for it and it would tell you, it would surface all the fact check reports by certified fact checking groups around that content. There's some other work, there's work that we have done on gender abuse. So we have a plugin for user end redaction of gender abuse, but that's not for WhatsApp. That's actually for more open platforms such as, Twitter. Like, basically it now works on most websites on a browser. So it'll also work on a Wikipedia, it'll also work on a Google. But the idea there is that from the perspective of the people who are at the receiving end, we want them to be protected from it, so they can actually have the energy to be expressive and use these platforms for social, economic, cultural, like productive activities, as opposed to just being fatigued by abuse and then receding from these platforms altogether. The other sort of aspect is that it also sensitizes people to the sort of over deluge of abusive and problematic language online. So that's one of the other projects. I think generally for us, we spend a lot of time thinking about transparency of platforms. So we spend a lot of time thinking about how do you actually collect and research mobile apps, social media platforms, and I think like it's studying what is happening on mobile is whether it is content on WhatsApp, but also let's say the ads that you're getting targeted by on your Facebook mobile app, right? I think things like those, that's actually quite a bit harder to crack because the web sort of interface, the browser interface, is quite amenable to existing hacky investigative tools, but mobile apps and the operating systems were just not designed for a lot of, I guess. I don't think the web world was designed for investigation either, but I think the technical infrastructure is open enough that it allows for it, whereas that's almost next to impossible to do on mobile. And so I think we, as many other researchers across the world, are trying to understand, okay, how do you understand what is actually happening on mobile apps? So that's something we spend some time on as well. I also want to flag some of the projects from other countries that I think have done things really well. There's a project in, I want to say Malawi, but the country is actually Zimbabwe. And so what they did in Zimbabwe was that they actually worked with a trusted civil society organization, and they would run newsletters through the CSO. And so this was specifically around COVID-19 misinformation. And as a result of these newsletters that a trusted civil society organization was running, there was an increase in knowledge about the pandemic, and people were more likely to adhere to like lockdown guidelines. And so I think just tying this to what I'd mentioned earlier, that people believe what they see on WhatsApp primarily because they trust and it mirrors offline associations. I think that's also in some ways a key to how you sort of think about solutions, which is that you merge that offline trust with the scale of a messaging platform, and basically do your messaging accordingly.
Actually, going back to something that you said, you talked about fact checking. So can you briefly just tell us about what the fact checking ecosystem in India is like? Like, how is it organized? How active is fact checking in India? How have you been thinking about going about it?
So the first thing to clarify is we are not fact checkers. I think we are very interested in the fact checking ecosystem, and we care about increasing the reach of fact check content, but we don't fact check ourselves. When we started in 2018, 2019, there were 3 fact-checking groups in India. A lot of them were, very sort of ideologically driven. There was a sense of, okay, we're doing community service, at least for some, if not all. In the US, fact-checking was also something, that was tied to presidential speeches. So I think even in the 2008 presidential elections, you had people who would take every claim that a president had made in that speech and fact check it, right? So there was also like live fact checking on news channels. I think what's happened since then is that most platforms have started tying up with these trusted third-party fact checkers, and it's allowed them to say that we are not the ones who are taking down this content. There's a third independent organization that has said that this content is misinformation, and therefore we will either remove it or reduce the visibility of this content, right? It's also become so almost like a revenue model now for a lot for organizations. So over the last 3 to 4 years, we've seen a rise in the number of fact checkers globally, and I think India is now at like over 18. And it's been very interesting to see how it started as these very small 3 to 5 individuals, like sort of doing this with a lot of frustration and anger at what was happening and why were people falling for it, to now even very established big media houses having a fact-checking wing that has a tie-up with a platform. And these are not just the global platforms, even the Indian platforms have followed suit, and they will partner with third-party fact checkers.
That's very interesting to listen to, Tarunima. And does fact checking work, or like how effective is fact checking? I've read, certain scholars who say that the misinformation problem is such a large scale that thinking of the problem as individual fact checking will not really get us where we want. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, we need a variety of approaches. I don't want to, diss on fact checking altogether. I think it has become very prominent in part because of how much emphasis platforms have sort of placed on it. But I don't want to say that it's completely ineffective and we should redirect our attention to other approaches altogether, right? So with fact checking, it's become a fairly intense area of research, understandably, because of the growth in fact checking over the last 4 years. And so there's some research to show that fact checking is most effective, like if you tell someone that they are, or if you warn people about potential misinformation before they've even received it. So pre-bunking, for example, has a deeper effect than debunking, which is that you correct an information after someone has read it, right? But then there's also research to show that if you fact check something, a very sort of low visibility claim, you actually also give it visibility. And so in some ways, sometimes fact checking can amplify like information which otherwise would have just been suppressed and no one would have come across it. It's fairly complicated space. Having said that, I think we can agree that fact checking has some positive effect, right? I think there were some concerns a decade or so ago about something called the backfire effect, which is that, if you fact check something, it will reinforce my original sort of belief instead of correcting it. That has not sort of borne out through repeated experiments. So I think fact checking has its role. I do think it's overemphasized, and we need to think of a more holistic approach to responding to misinformation, because as you rightly said, it sort of focuses on this individual piece of content. We should all be careful about what we even choose to first read.
So I think before we conclude, we just wanted to ask you about how this is all playing out in the Indian legal context. So recently, the Indian government made a change to the law, and they asked primarily social media companies to take down misinformation, specifically misinformation which might be about the government. What do you think about this regulation?
So I see this regulation as the broader as a part of this broader trend of digital sovereignty, or like the calls for digital sovereignty, because right now the fact checking groups that platforms will partner with have to be certified. For most platforms, they only partner with fact checking groups that have been certified by something called the IFCN, which is the International Fact Checking Network. But that framework has been set by a US based institution. And so Europe also came out saying, why should we be listening, or why should we be subject to something that a US entity or a protocol that a US entity has set up? And so Europe set up something called the European Fact Checking Standards. I think, European Fact Checking Standards Network. And I think India sort of followed suit, and India was like, well, yes, why should we also be subject to how US or some US organization thinks about fact checking? India needs to have its own standards. I think to some extent what IFCN is saying is not radical. It's saying that you must be sort of non-partisan. It's saying that that the fact checking group must demonstrate that rigor in testing out sources, finding alternate viewpoints, or like basically calling on both sides. It's fairly it feels fairly standard, like journalistic practice. And I think even if India was to come up with its own standards, it needs to, I can't see it be completely different from some of these other standards, because also that we're not just looking at content from India. So when you're on a platform or a fact checker is looking at a post, that post is also visible to someone in another country. And so you can't have these differential norms. And I also don't know how different these norms could possibly be, right? Like, it's not these standards are not very sort of prescriptive and specific to begin with. Yeah, I mean, I think I see the instinct. I just don't know how productive it is. I also, I think the fact checking community in India is also concerned about sort of being robust and being independent, and so they simultaneously are subscribed to these IFCN norms, and so even if the government sets up the self-regulatory organization, etc., I think the fact checkers are going to have to be consistent across both if they do care about the certification, right? I actually realize I haven't fully answered your question. It's just because I think I'm a little bit in the weeds of the specifics of what's happening here. But I think my first instinct with this proposal was to say that this is just not a very helpful proposal. I don't know why we are obsessed with, takedowns on, say, government or fact-checked information about the government. It is an improvement from having one fact checker, which was what the original proposal was, right? Like having one organization fact check and platforms being compelled to take that down. So I think this consensus sort of self-regulatory organization which has multiple fact checkers is an improvement from that. Yeah, I think it remains to be seen how it plays out. I to the extent that this is specific to government content, that the SRO is only going to apply to government content, I am less concerned. I think again the devil will be in the detail, and how flexibly the government interprets what government content is. I think that's going to be critical to watch.
Thanks, Tarunima. Last question, and if you can just answer it in like 30 seconds in a way that, what can our listeners do when they face misinformation that they know, or they want to check certain information, whether it's true or not? What do you say to people?
I think looking at a piece of content and thinking about why has someone shared this or why has someone written this, thinking about that can bring some criticality. So yeah, so I'll start with attention conservation, which I've already mentioned, which is that you don't have to read and open every piece of media item that you get on WhatsApp. Yeah, your attention is precious. Think about what you want to devote it to. So that's one. The second is, if you want to fact check content, there are, as I mentioned, 11 plus sites. Boom is one that comes to mind. There's News Checker, there's News Meter. I actually don't want to put, there's Factly. There are so many of them, right? There are organizations that just very specifically will look at viral content and would have fact checked it. So if you are someone who's comfortable with Googling, please Google it. You will get a fact check source. And then, because I think fact checking can sometimes be a labor intensive process, I would say be critical of and think about why someone has shared or why someone has written something. What could be the agenda behind having written a piece like that? And I think that criticality can make us healthy media consumers as well.
Thanks so much, Taruna. That was a great conversation. Again, as it often is, I can talk about this problem with the whole day, but we do have a time restriction, and it was great talking to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Shashank and Nidhi, for having me.
Thanks, Tarunima. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
We would love to hear your thoughts on the episode and your suggestions on what topics you would like us to cover. You can reach out to us through email or find us on our social media. We will link the details of these in the show notes. Lastly, we would like to thank National Law University Delhi and the Friedrich Naumann Foundation for Freedom for their support in creating the podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please like and subscribe wherever you're listening to the podcast. We look forward to bringing you more content. This podcast is created by Center for Communication Governance at National Law University Delhi. This episode was edited by Gopika.